Hi, welcome to this training on autism, a brief overview of the history and characteristics of autism. So to start, I always like to remind people, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Everyone is unique and has their own traits or quirks, but there are characteristics that, we see in all people with autism at various levels. But just keep in mind that everyone is still unique, autistic or not autistic. Autism spectrum disorder. It is a spectrum. So that's the first thing that we want to make sure that we understand. It's a developmental disorder that causes significant social, communication, and behavioral challenges. ASD being a spectrum, it does mean that it affects each person in different ways and can range from very mild to very severe. So people with ASD share similar symptoms, as I said, such as problems with social interaction or problems with certain behaviors, but again, there's uniqueness throughout. There's differences in when the symptoms start, how severe they are, and that exact nature of the symptoms, and we just need to keep that in mind. Statistics. I think it's a good place for us to begin this training as an overview with statistics because we are seeing, a lot of, in the last year or two especially, there are a lot of varying opinions, and I will say that, opinions, not facts, that you can hear and see on social media or in the news. So it's important to know what the facts are and why certain statistics may or may not look the way that they do currently. So more people than ever before are being diagnosed with autism. Factors of this increase. There is a broader definition of ASD now. I'm going to kind of get into the DSM-4 versus the DSM-5 and what that has meant. So there's a broader definition of ASD. There are better efforts in diagnosis. And there are better and more comprehensive diagnostic tools for the clinicians who are diagnosing children and adults with autism. So because of those factors alone, you're going to see an increase in the number of people diagnosed with autism. On top of that, there may in fact be a true increase in the number of people with ASD. We can't rule that out. However, the first factors that I kind of just brought up, that broader definition of ASD, better efforts in diagnosis, more comprehensive diagnostic tools, those factors are huge in the fact that the numbers of people with a diagnosis of autism has increased. So just a few years ago, it was 1 in 36, and now it is 1 in 31 children in the U.S. have a diagnosis of autism. 1 in 45 adults in the U.S. Has an autistic diagnosis as well. Boys versus girls in the U.S., about nearly 4 times more likely. Boys are nearly 4 times more likely than girls to be diagnosed with autism. So 4 in 100 boys and 1 in 100 girls have that autistic diagnosis. Part of the reason, this is a personal opinion, I think it's harder for a diagnosis in girls, kind of like we see it sometimes trickier or harder to get a diagnosis of ADHD in girls based on how it presents and what's deemed, a characteristic of a disorder. It can kind of be masked in girls, and it's a little bit trickier. So I think that's a factor in that. But that is the stats that we're seeing. In the U.S., autism prevalence is lower among white children than other racial and ethnic groups. Part of the reason I think that we're seeing that is these changes reflect an improvement in outreach, screening, and destigmatization of autism diagnosis among minority communities. Oftentimes, autism really did have a stigmatizing aura around it, that it was, really seen as not a good thing, and you didn't want your child to be diagnosed with autism. Still can be, but there is more and more education and training for society as a whole to kind of help destigmatize that, and therefore another contributing factor to why we're seeing an increase in autistic diagnosis, because more people than ever are willing to hear and seek out these diagnoses for their children. And we do look to early intervention when we're looking at diagnosis because it's so important. Autism can be reliably diagnosed by a specialist, typically by the age of 2. The average age of autism diagnosis in the US, though, is 5 years old. And one of the reasons, the average age of diagnosis for children in lower income households is 4.5 compared to 5.2 in higher income households. So there is a little bit of a range. But overall, say that 4 to 5 years is when typically we see our children being diagnosed with autism in the United States. Sometimes it does take longer for a diagnosis to happen if it's a more mild case of autism. And that is because simply a lot of times those characteristics don't manifest themselves until higher level social skills are needed. A caveat, though, that early intervention is so critically important, and it's really great that we're seeing that increase, because with early intervention, early diagnosis, you can have early intervention supports and services for students or children who have a diagnosis of autism. And with that early intervention of skills being taught explicitly to them, as soon as possible, we're seeing a lot of those weaknesses and areas of deficits that children have that has gotten them a diagnosis of autism are being taught and met, and then we're seeing skills increase, and then therefore they can go on to live, functional lives where they can access school at high levels and access the community and work at high levels. So that early intervention is so critically important. Now, a little bit about the history of how we've gotten to where we are. Back in 1943, Leo Kanner was a child psychologist who first used the term autism in its modern sense as we know it and hear it today. He noticed a group of 11 children who displayed much of the same behavioral characteristics. And he introduced the term infantile autism in a paper that he wrote and was published. And he really talked about the two main things that he noticed in this group of 11 children that he was observing was that whole that idea of autistic aloneness, he labeled it, and insistence on sameness. And they're still two of the typical characteristics that's still regarded as characterizing autism today. In his work and how he used the term autism, it did lead to kind of decades from that 43 on, a couple of decades of confused terminology where autism, infantile autism, and infantile schizophrenia were kind of meshed and confused. And with that entwinement, there was a confusion, and there kind of came this thought process that, autism was coming from maternal deprivation, and the whole term of refrigerator mothers kind of came to be born in those couple of decades, that a coldness of the mother was the reason that a child developed autism. And much of the therapy or any of the treatments that were put into place was done with taking the child and separating them from their families to provide that service, as a result of thinking that there was some causation there. And that was only about 80 years ago. So we're not even, this isn't even a 100-year-old diagnosis. So 80 years ago, it was that refrigerator mother kind of thought process. And then in the 1960s, it actually was an American psychologist named Bernie Rimland who had a child of his own that had autism. He was able to kind of look at it, and he was very influential in disputing that theory. And he did a lot of work around disputing the fact that, no, it does not appear that cold and unloving mothers were the cause of autism in their children. And so that during the 60s and during his work and others' work, that shift began to happen. And in the late 1960s, autism was established as a separate syndrome, as we kind of know it, or as it's becoming to be known today. It was the late 1960s that was occurring. So what does it look like? This is to help you understand when you're working with students in your classroom, what a student with autism, some behavioral perspective of what that might manifest itself as. And remember, as we go through all of this is a brief overview, just so you have a really good general idea of what autism is and what it's not. And it is a spectrum disorder, so mild to severe. You have the gamut. We'll get into that more, but just really kind of breaking it down for yourself to think of the severe as the ones that are nonverbal and highly maladaptive, disruptive behaviors, at the one end of the spectrum to students that, intellectually compared to their peers and can do fairly well in classes, but, really still have a hard time reading social skills or reading social cues and interacting socially, and might have some quirky, repetitive, or, odd behaviors that manifest themselves. So it's an overview, and then there is a spectrum. So possible behavioral deficits that you might notice in your class. Again, language and communication, social skills, self-help skills. That's one that often will manifest within the classroom. The ability to function in those self-help skills to be able to participate in class at higher levels. Play and leisure skills. And you might see an intellectual disability as well. Possible behavioral excesses that you might see is, that self-stimulatory behavior, stim-like behavior, rigidity, inflexibility, tantrums, outbursts, aggression at low to high levels, and you might see self-injurious behavior. So from a behavioral perspective, though, what are some strengths that we sometimes see with students that are identified with autism? And strengths can look like having a really fantastic rote memory. Students with autism, they think in pictures. An autistic brain is a brain that thinks in pictures, and that's a really great skill to have, and it can be helpful in a lot of different ways. Most people, when I work with adults, as some of our trainings that'll help you be able to effectively work with students with autism, I always remind them that oftentimes we are more verbal beings, and we're working with students that really do. They think and they understand far more effectively in pictures. So even if they're very verbal, their wheelhouse, or where their strength is in pictures, and that's why pictures are so important even for verbal students that you work with who have autism. And then the other thing from possible strengths that you might see with students with autism is that whole idea of splinter skills, where they might be have deficits in certain skills that you're teaching at your grade level or in your content. However, they sometimes will have these random splinter skills that they're just like so brilliant with. Like they might be brilliant at playing the piano, or some students know so much about geography, or so much about a certain time period, or really I've had students that are so fantastic with dates. They can tell you like 6 years ago December 7th was on a Tuesday. Like just certain splinter skills that are just like, usually they're really they're fun to interact with them on, and mind-blowing with what they're able to do and tell you or perform. So again, you might see some splinter skills like that, which is fun to have in your classroom. Other things to kind of keep in mind, what it looks like, other possible characteristics: hyperactivity, very active; impulsivity, acting without thinking; short attention span. Then some of the things that we often see come up is like unusual eating and sleeping habits, unusual mood and emotions reactions, reacting super big to something that really doesn't typically get a super big reaction; lack of fear or too much fear. You can see both ends of that. And then a really unusual reactions to the way things sound, smell, taste, look, or feel, like a sensory overload or underload, like reaction to their world that might look different than you're used to seeing. So those are other characteristics that you might see in students. What I'm going to talk about next, for the next bit of this overview, is the DSM-4 versus the DSM-5. And keep in mind, the DSM-4, it is the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders, and there's been different editions along the way. And the DSM-5, I believe, came out around 2013. So before that, in the DSM-4, just to hit upon what we heard, there were 3 developmental disabilities that you typically heard about. Autistic disorder was one of them, and that's autism is more the severe as we kind of know it, having those language delays and social and communication challenges and unusual behaviors and interests. And then that also having that maladaptive behavior of, self-injurious behavior, aggression, those tantrums, emotional outbursts, sleep disturbance. Then the term that a lot of people, especially if you've been in education, more than 10, 15 years, you often heard Asperger's syndrome or high functioning autism, but it was called Asperger's syndrome from the DSM-4. And that was, someone might have social challenges and unusual behaviors and interests, but, they weren't as significant as someone with autistic disorder. and it tended to be more mild, Asperger's. And they might have some problem behaviors, but again, it tended to be more mild. And then the last one in the DSM-4 was pervasive development disorder, not otherwise specified, PDD, NOS. And it was kind of the catch-all that, they met some of the criteria for autism and some of the criteria for Asperger's, but not all. And so then it was kind of like this catch place for that. If they didn't quite meet all of the criteria of either one of those, but did have some from each, and they also had some intellectual disability or maybe some behaviors displayed, they would fall into that category. But now, for over a decade, we've been at the DSM-5, and now there's only a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and you'll hear that, ASD, autism spectrum disorder. That is the diagnosis that we have now. And what clinicians look at for impairment is in two domains, and the two domains are social communication and interaction. And then the second one is about behavior and rigidity. But the first one, that's social communication and interaction, they look at having a lack of skills in those areas across multiple contexts, and they can be manifested in the following ways. Having deficits in social emotion reciprocity, ranging from an abnormal or awkward social approach to a social situation, a failure of that normal back and forth conversation, to reduce sharings of interests, emotions, or affect, to just failure to initiate or respond to social interactions, failure to talk about a different topic than they want to talk about, all those kind of examples, as well as deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, because in social interaction, there's so much that's body language and that's nonverbal, and there's a lot of social reciprocity that needs to happen as a result of that. And so that can range from poorly integrated ability to use their own nonverbal communication, to having abnormal eye contact, body language, or deficits in understanding of use of gestures, to a total lack of facial expressions or nonverbal communication, to be totally in someone's bubble or out of someone's bubble, just a real, missing in those areas. Then also deficits in maintaining and understanding relationships. So this can range from, difficulties adjusting their behavior to meet the situation that's in front of them, like that, how you behave at a doctor's office versus a classroom versus a church versus at home or out with your friends, that you might socially act differently in all those venues. That ability to understand the nuances of those differences can be really hard for someone on this that has ASD. And also in this area, difficulties in sharing imaginative play can be a deficit or difficulty for them, or making friends in general can be really hard. And it can range all the way to the absence of any interest in peers or friends. So that's under the social communication area. But then the second domain that the DSM-5 looks at for diagnosis is in the area of restricted repetitive behaviors. So restricted repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities. And it can be manifested by at least two of the following. It's that repetitive stereotyped motor movements, so stimming, or use of objects or speech to stim in that repetitive way, whether it's with lining up toys or flipping objects or saying something, having kind of like phrases that are done on repeat. So that's one way. Then there's also that insistence on sameness, inflexibility, to their routines, or having a realized pattern of verbal or nonverbal behavior. So maybe extreme distress to small changes, difficulty with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, ways that you do things, like needing to eat in the same way, needing to eat the same thing, needing to take the same path to certain classes. That real inflexibility to how they do life can come into play in this part of the diagnosis. Also within this domain is that highly restrictive fixated interests that, have abnormal intensity or focus on certain things. And so, strong attachment to or preoccupation with, unusual objects, or excessively or perseverative interests, where that's their main focus and they really have a hard time deviating from that. What the DSM-5 also did is it included as part of the diagnosis, which hadn't been included before, the whole idea of including sensory issues as part of the diagnosis. What we see is a characteristic in a lot of students with autism. So that whole idea of hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input, or sometimes unusual interests in sensory aspects of the environment. So maybe examples can be like indifference to pain or temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, or having excessive smelling or touching of objects that they act behaviors that they might engage in, as well as visual fascination with lights or movement and certain things. Just how they take in their sensory environment can be at different levels than you see with someone that doesn't have autism. The other thing that came into play with the DSM-5 and the autistic diagnosis is the severity levels. That was not included in the DSM-4. You just had autism, Asperger's, and PDD-NOS. So Asperger's was that higher functioning, but in the DSM-5, as part of the ASD diagnosis, they do look at severity levels. And within those characteristics that I described, the social communication and the behavior, the repetitive ritualistic behavior, there are 3 levels, and it's level 3, level 2, and level 1. So those are levels of severity, and those levels of severity spell out and look at what support someone would need depending on the level of severity that they are diagnosed with. So level 3 autism is the one that is requiring very substantial support. And then level 2 says requires substantial support, and level 1 is requires support. And so if you're thinking about it, level 3 would be your most significant students or children with autism. So they have those deficits in verbal and nonverbal social communication skills. This is where someone who is nonverbal would fall into the level 3 category, and real difficulty with, communicating verbally, communicating functionally in general, and then the social communication or the social skills to interact with other people is definitely a skill deficit if you're in a level 3 autism diagnosis. And the restrictive repetitive behaviors, that's when you'd really see that inflexibility of behavior, rigidity, wanting things a certain way, having a hard time coping with their environment, coping with changes, coping with transitions. And it really kind of interferes with all spheres of their lives. All of this, it kind of interferes across the board when you're looking at a level 3 diagnosis. Where level 2, again, requiring substantial support. So you're going to have some of these, you're going to have same characteristics and deficits in the areas we've discussed. Just it might be you are verbal. Oftentimes level 2, you're going to be able to communicate on some level, whether with a communication device or with words, but there is limited the limited verbal engagement from a social communication standpoint. That's still very difficult and needs explicit support to help. And then you might really have you'll see your students still kind of have those really narrowed interests on a level 2 from as far as social communication, and might have some markedly odd nonverbal communication that they use or they partake in. And then restrictive repetitive behaviors, again, that inflexibility of behavior, difficulty coping with all the things that we kind of discussed for level 1, but with the support and in place, oftentimes can become more functional, as can level 3, can become very functional with the right support services and interventions. But this is just kind of how it's broken out. And that restrictive repetitive behavior, still distress and or difficulty changing focus and attention, very much a part of the level 2 autism. And level 1 does require support, and this is more of your high functioning, if you will, autism, where there's going to be definitely without supports in place, deficits in that social communication in particular cause noticeable impairments. So they're going to be very verbal, level 1 autism, and they're going to look and sound like they should understand what's going on around them. And I will often say, or I always do say, that helping to support students with level 1 autism is oftentimes the most difficult, because level 3 autism, it's really clear to someone that someone has an impairment, that someone has a disability. Level 2, it still pretty is. As you get on the further end of the more mild end of the spectrum, people, these students sound like they know what's going on. They're very smart. They have a lot of capability and a lot of skills for sure. And they still have deficits. So they still have, without supports in place, they're still going to have trouble with social communication that can get in the way. They might have decreased interest in social interactions. And they might be able to, speak in really full sentences and have, the pleasantries to start a conversation, but as they engage in more back and forth and to and fro, it might become more difficult for them. This is when I recently worked with a doctor who used the term cocktail chatter. And she said, they'll have good cocktail chatter skills, meaning you're at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, cocktail hour, and you're able to, hold your drink and kind of laugh at certain jokes or contribute here or there. And so you look the part and you're integrated. But say we're thinking 100%, you're only taking in 30% of what's going on around you and understanding, and you're missing about 70%. And so there's a lot of social nuances that's going on around you that you're not getting. And if everyone in the room thinks you are, and they think you're at the same understanding as them, and you're not, because you missed it because of those skills that you don't have, that can be really impactful. So knowing that and helping students with that, it's really, really important. And we have to be careful not to just say, they should be able to do that when they really can't, and they need the help and support to understand and interact. And with that correct help and support and grace given to them by the adults, they can be very, very successful in the classroom. And then again, still with level 1, you still will see an inflexibility of, without, the right approach. Switching between activities can still be pretty tricky for them, and they might have problems organizing and planning for higher independence, that really those executive functional skills, and able to plan for that really independent kind of lifestyle might be pretty tricky for them. Another thing when thinking about diagnosis is symptom onset and the impact to functioning, how it impacts someone's ability to function in all spheres of their life. So we do, with the diagnosis, still say symptoms must be present. The DSM-5 still says in the early development period. It accounts for the fact, though, of it might not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities, so till social demands are at a higher level, and then, or it may be masked by learned strategies later in life. So that's where you have your adolescents, particularly girls, but both girls and boys, that have these skills that they've learned along the way that can kind of mask when they're not understanding what's going on, and can get them by, but they truly aren't taking in and being able to understand their environment at a higher level so that they can function at their highest level. The other thing, so that's about onset. So we might be diagnosing later because they don't appear until later. And also those symptoms, they are needed to have, cause clinically significant impairment to social, occupational, or other important areas of function. So social, occupational, community, academic, all aspects of life, it impedes the ability to function within it. Other factors to keep in mind when they're making the diagnosis, the clinicians, is the disturbances that you see in someone, not better explained by intellectual disability or global developmental delay, because intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder frequently co-occur. So you might have a comorbid diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, but social communication should be below that expected for general development to have that autistic diagnosis. DSM-5 also says that symptoms of people with ASD will fall on a continuum. Again, as we've talked about, just really making sure that everyone understands that there is that mild to more severe. And the spectrum will allow clinicians to account for the variations in symptoms and behaviors from person to person, allowing to see that, it all very unique, from that very mild to the more severe. So in keeping in mind, I want you to remember, I do believe that, this diagnosis and being able to understand that it's a spectrum, it's an important part of it. But a caveat I want to put on that I have seen in the last year or two as well. I started with statistics being so important because there's a lot of, I think, misinformation or misopinions that float pretty freely around the internet. The other thing that I have seen, it's now far more common because of that destigmatization as well, to hear people being labeled and called autistic without a diagnosis. So, sometimes people will be like, oh yeah, I've got certain characteristics of autism, or I'm slightly autistic, or I can relate in this way. And it's not to say you might not have characteristics of autism. A lot of us do, because we all have maybe some rigidity or some social anxiety. There's a lot of ways that we can say, oh, that makes sense, I'm kind of like that. But yeah, you can have characteristics of that. And if it's not at a level that, remember, one of those diagnoses that they look at is that it impedes your ability to function within various spheres of your environment. Like I said, with your job, with school, with your family, with social situations, that it impacts your ability to function in those areas far more than just kind of, being quirky or, having a hyper focus on a certain interest that you stay to. That can definitely play a part in who you are, but it doesn't rise to the level of an autistic diagnosis. Because ASD, it's a complex disorder. That's what we need to walk away from this training. I hope you walk away understanding and knowing it is a complex disorder. And it involves many areas of the brain, which is a complex organ in our bodies. It doesn't involve just one part or one chromosome, like one marker. There's many aspects of the brain that's involved in autism. And so because you have that, there's just not one indicator. And so that's why it's so diverse. That's why it's so complex. That's why there's so many people, where it's like not so clear to understand if you have this, then it's this. So the brain is an amazing organ, and you can read and listen to neuroscientists or neurologists, doctors, that's all they do, and we still don't know. They still don't know a lot about the brain, and that's the big part of why the diagnosis of autism is it's not clean cut. It's not straightforward. It has these areas of gray. But, the more knowledge we have, the more education we have, and especially as people who work with students who have autism, having an understanding of what it means when you do have a student with autism in front of you, I think that's just critically important, so we can give them the supports and services they need and the grace to kind of create the environment they need to help them be healthy and successful and live their best lives. So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening and being a part of this training. I hope it was helpful and informative for you. Again, it's just a brief overview, so you have an understanding of what to expect when you are working with students with autism. We do, as always, there is a link to the PowerPoint, so you can print that out and have that as a resource for later. And I would invite you to message any questions or comments you might have on the contact portion of our website at mcbrideconsultingllc.com. And thank you again. Be well.